A man in a tailored suit stands by a quiet river at night. In his arms, a newborn wrapped in hospital linen. No name, no cradle song, no second thought, just water and silence. Why would a wealthy father abandon his own child in the dark? What kind of heart hardens so deeply that a baby becomes disposable? And what if that child left to die, forgotten by blood, survived? What if she grew up, not broken, but stronger, sharper? What if she wore a black robe of justice and one day looked that man in the eyes from behind a judge's bench? This is not just a story of cruelty and survival. It's about what we choose to carry forward, the names we give ourselves when others erase us, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. If stories like this move you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We promise stories that stay with you, stories that speak when the world tries to go quiet. Now, let's begin. The rain came down in thin, cold needles that night. Not a storm, not a downpour, just relentless, steady rain. It washed the edges of the old wooden bridge in North Bend County, Virginia. The air was damp with fog and something heavier. A black luxury car pulled up beside the guardrail. The engine purred like a threat. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in a charcoal suit that didn't belong in a place like this. His name was Gordon Leland. $60 million in real estate assets, 49 properties, 3 wives, and tonight 1 newborn daughter wrapped in linen and silence. He walked around the car without an umbrella. In the back seat, a tiny bundle moved. The baby didn't cry, didn't even stir when he lifted her. Her skin was flushed pink, her cheeks puffed with sleep. Gordon looked down at her, jaw tight. It should have been a boy. He muttered. The child blinked. Her eyes were open, now gray, searching, still. "You won't carry my name," he said, barely above a whisper. Then, without ceremony or regret, he stepped forward and dropped her over the edge. A soft splash followed. Then stillness. He didn't watch. He didn't wait. He walked back to his car, pulled the door shut, and drove off into the curtain of rain, his windshield wipers scrubbing away the last trace of what he had done. But the night had eyes. Just below the bridge, tucked under a rusted support beam, an old RV was parked on the gravel embankment. Its tiny window glowed faintly. Inside sat a woman with deep smile lines and rain-dark hair, Eleanor Reed sipping weak tea from a thermos. Her husband, Marcus, was fiddling with the RV's broken heater. Eleanor heard the car doors, then silence, then water, something small hitting the water. She was already at the door when Marcus called out, "Hell, it's pouring. What's wrong?" "There's someone up there," she said, already pulling on her boots. She stepped out, rain soaking her shoulders. Her eyes caught a ripple below the bridge. Something small, something pale was floating in the current. "Marcus," she shouted, "get down here." Marcus didn't ask. He ran. By the time he reached the bank, he could just make out the shape small, drifting, barely above the surface. He dove in without thinking. The water was freezing. His limbs went numb within seconds, but he pushed toward it, lungs tight with panic. When he came back up, gasping, one arm flailing to tread water, the other was cradling something, a soaked, silent bundle. Eleanor knelt in the mud and pulled it from his arms. The baby wasn't moving. "Oh no," she whispered. "Please no." She peeled back the wet fabric. The child's lips were purple. Her chest was still, then a cough, then another, then a cry thin and broken, but real. She's alive." Marcus breathed, collapsing beside them. Eleanor pressed the baby against her chest, wrapping her in her own coat, shivering uncontrollably. They sat there for a minute, just the three of them, the river rushing quietly behind them. Back inside the RV, Eleanor dried the child with an old flannel shirt. She boiled water for a warm bottle, whispering prayers between every movement. Marcus watched from across the table, his face pale. "We have to call someone," he said finally. "Maybe," she replied. "They'll ask questions," he added. "Whose baby? How we found her? Why we waited?" She looked down at the little girl, now swaddled and asleep in her arms. "She would have died if we hadn't been there." "I know. She would have died." Marcus. Someone wanted that. The silence between them stretched out like a shadow. "We call them," he said slowly, "and this becomes complicated real fast. You know how it works around here. That car, that man, he was somebody." "Exactly," she said. "And if we give her to the system, she'll go back to people like him." Marcus ran his hand over his face. "We've tried, haven't we?" Eleanor whispered. "For 5 years." He looked at her, at the way she held the baby, at the quiet desperation in her voice. "Maybe this isn't an accident," she said. "Maybe this is what we've been waiting for." He didn't speak. He just nodded once and looked away. They named her Clara. No last name, no birth certificate. Just a quiet promise between two people who refused to let a child die in the cold. And outside, the rain finally stopped. The next morning, the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. Inside the RV, Eleanor sat cross-legged on the floor, rocking Clara gently. She had barely slept. Neither had Marcus. The heater still rattled, barely working. The baby, now warm and fed, lay curled against Eleanor's chest like she'd always belonged there. Marcus leaned against the counter, arms folded. "We can't stay," he said softly. "Not here." Eleanor didn't answer. "If someone comes looking," he added. "They won't," she said, too quickly. "We don't know that." She looked up. Her eyes were tired, but unwavering. "You saw what he did?" "I did." "Then you know what kind of man we're dealing with." Marcus turned, walked to the tiny sink, and turned on the faucet. Just a trickle. "We're not equipped to raise a baby. Elle, we don't even have hot water half the time." She stared at him. "We have hearts. That's more than he had." He sighed, deeply, like his lungs were full of rocks. I don't want us to get arrested for doing the right thing." He said. "We could lose her." Eleanor looked down at Clara, who yawned in her sleep. "Maybe," she whispered, "but I'd rather carry that risk than know we handed her back to the people who tried to erase her. They spent that day planning, not packing, not yet, just planning, in that quiet, unspoken way people do when they're on the edge of a life they didn't expect." By evening, Marcus had pulled out the old map they kept tucked under the seat cushions. They traced roads with their fingers, talked about counties with fewer eyes. They circled a small town in central Illinois, a place with no ties, no connections, no memory of them. "I can find work," Marcus said, "manual labor, whatever." "I can work nights," Eleanor offered, "maybe a diner. And what do we tell people that she's ours?" He paused. "What if someone figures it out?" Eleanor gently kissed Clara's forehead. "Then we tell them she was unwanted, and we wanted her." 2 days later, they left before dawn. The RV was old, sputtering, but faithful. They kept the lights off until they were miles from North Bend. No one stopped them. They crossed 3 state lines. They arrived in Willow Bend, Illinois, a place so small you could walk its length in 10 minutes. There was a faded grocery store, a public library barely bigger than a living room, a church with peeling paint, and a pastor who shook hands too long. But it was quiet. Nobody asked too many questions. Perfect. They rented a tiny trailer just outside town. Marcus got work doing odd jobs fixing fences, clearing brush, laying concrete. Eleanor waitressed at the town cafe. They told people Clara was their miracle baby, and people believed them, because Eleanor looked at her like she'd always been hers. And Marcus, even when he doubted, never showed it to the world. But in the dark, when Clara cried at 2 a.m., Marcus would sometimes sit in the kitchen, head in his hands. Did we do the right thing, he'd whisper. And Eleanor, always calm, always sure, would say, we chose life. That's never wrong. Still, doubts clung to the edges of their days. Clara grew fast. She was quiet, like the night they found her, but alert, sharp. She watched the world as if she were waiting for it to blink first. By her 5th birthday, she was already asking questions other kids didn't. Why do people lie? Why do some people hurt babies? Where do I come from? Eleanor always answered gently, but never dishonestly. You came from somewhere broken, she once said, but you were never broken. On Clara's 8th birthday, Eleanor gave her a wooden keepsake box. Inside was the pink flannel shirt Eleanor had used to warm her that first night. Clara tilted her head. Whose was this? Eleanor hesitated. Yours. It was the first thing that touched you after the water. Clara looked at it for a long time, then folded it and placed it back into the box. I think it's my favorite thing. And just like that, the past became a quiet guest in their lives, not erased, not hidden, but softened, stored gently. Clara Reed had no idea who had left her that night, and for now, that was enough. She had a home, she had warmth, she had a name, and that name would one day echo in places far beyond Willow Bend, 27 years later. Clara Reed sat alone in her chambers, just outside Chicago. The courthouse window was open, and the wind stirred the edge of a legal brief on her desk. She was only 27, but her presence carried more gravity than most judges twice her age. Calm, exacting, unshakably composed. The kind of woman who didn't raise her voice, but didn't have to. The plaque on her desk read, Hahn, Clara E. Reed, U.S. Circuit Court Judge. She often stared at it in the mornings, not out of pride, but out of disbelief. Not because she had made it, but because she had survived. There were still nights Clara woke up with fragments of dreams' cold water, the feeling of drifting, a woman's voice calling her name in the dark. She knew they weren't memories, not real ones, but echoes, pieces her brain had shaped from stories, because when she turned 18, Eleanor and Marcus sat her down and gave her the truth. No preamble, no sugarcoating. We found you, Eleanor had said softly. You were alone, in the river, wrapped in hospital linen. They showed her the blanket, the flannel shirt, the map with a red circle around North Bend County. Clara hadn't cried. She'd only asked, Did you ever find out who did it? Marcus had said no. Eleanor had looked her in the eyes and said, But if we hadn't been there, you wouldn't be, that night. Clara went outside and sat on the porch alone. She stared up at the stars until dawn. She didn't speak for 2 days, not out of anger, not even fear, but because she needed silence to sort through the noise inside her. What do you do when you find out you were discarded like trash, but someone chose to love you anyway? She could have fallen apart. Instead, she built something. In the years that followed, Clara worked harder than anyone around her. Graduated high school 2 years early, spent nights in the library reading case law for fun. Her professors said she had an unnerving sense of justice. At law school, she never raised her hand first, but when she spoke, the room fell quiet. She didn't chase victory. She chased clarity. By 26, she had become one of the youngest federal judges ever appointed in her circuit. Newspapers speculated, legal blogs debated, but Clara ignored it all, because behind every ruling, behind every opinion she wrote was the face of a child someone had tried to erase. She owed justice her life, so she gave it everything. But the past wasn't done with her. One night, she pulled up a news article about a developer under federal investigation for housing fraud and illegal evictions, Gordon Leland. She hadn't seen the name in years. Not since her first internship, when she had quietly hired a private investigator on a whim, asking him to look into any reported child disappearances in North Bend County during that time. One stood out. Leland had reported the death of his newborn daughter 3 days after her birth. No funeral, no grave, no autopsy, just a brief police statement. Presumed infant death, no remains. The story slipped through the cracks. No one questioned a man like Gordon Leland, but Clara had. She had traced blood types, medical records, inconsistencies. Then she saw a hospital surveillance image, a man in a suit carrying a bundled infant out the back entrance. Time-stamped 3:17 a.m. Clara downloaded the photo, zoomed in, stared, even blurry, even grainy. It was him, the man in her dreams, the voice in her nightmares, and the baby. The same pink hospital blanket folded in his arms now sat in a box under her bed. Her hand trembled, just once. Then she closed the file. She didn't tell Eleanor, or Marcus, not yet. She needed to think, because the question wasn't whether he had tried to kill her. The question was what to do now that she knew. Weeks passed. Clara focused on her docket, court motions, hearings, trials, until one Monday morning, her assistant walked in, eyes wide. "You're not going to believe this," he said, holding a file. "What is it, a corporate suit, whistleblower case, tenant abuse, and guess who the defendant is?" Clara didn't flinch, but her heart clenched. Who? He dropped the file on her desk. Gordon Leland. She waited until he left the room, opened the folder, stared at the black and white mugshot of a man who hadn't aged well, but still wore arrogance like a mask. And, for the first time in her life, Clara Reed's hands began to shake, but only for a second. Then she straightened the papers, took a breath, and whispered, "Justice doesn't forget, and neither do I." The courtroom was colder than usual, not in temperature, just in feeling. The kind of cold that came from polished floors and unspoken history. Judge Clara Reed sat in her chair, robe crisp, expression unreadable. Her fingers rested lightly on her notes, but her mind wasn't on them. Not yet. The bailiff opened the door. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Reed." Chairs scraped back. The courtroom stood, and then he walked in. Gordon Leland. He wore a navy suit, slightly ill-fitted around the shoulders. His salt and pepper hair was trimmed, but his face had softened into something bitter. Still, he walked like he owned the place. Clara didn't flinch, didn't blink, but inside, a pulse of ice traveled up her spine. She watched him approach the defense table. He didn't even look her way. He was already whispering to his attorney. Business as usual. To him, she was just another face behind a bench, another case to beat. He didn't recognize her, and that, somehow, was worse than if he had. The case began. 3 plaintiffs, all former employees, stood accusing Leland Properties of gross negligence, wage theft, and unlawful evictions. The details were brutal families forced out midwinter, children left without shelter, threats issued over back pay. Clara listened to the opening statements, nodded where appropriate, and ruled on the first few objections with professional calm. But her thoughts kept drifting to a riverbank, to wet flannel, to a name that didn't come from him. During the morning break, Clara stepped into her chambers and closed the door behind her. She didn't sit. She stood in front of the mirror above her filing cabinet, studying her own face. People always said she had a gaze that held weight. They didn't know who had helped her build it. When court resumed, Gordon took the stand. He leaned back in the chair like it was a boardroom. His attorney prompted him gently, like a father coaching a child. "I built this company from the ground up," Gordon said. "My decisions have always prioritized growth and development. I've created jobs, paid taxes, contributed to this city." Clara raised a brow, but said nothing. "I can't control every property manager under me. I trusted the wrong people, but I've always acted with integrity." She let the silence stretch before she spoke. "Mr. Leland," she said evenly, "can you explain why your company forcibly removed 38 tenants without legal warrants over a 6-month period?" He looked at her now, directly. And for the briefest moment something flickered in his eyes. Not recognition, but confusion, like her face tugged at a thread he couldn't quite name. "I was unaware of those specific decisions," he replied. "If that happened, it wasn't under my direct instruction." "I see." She turned the page on her docket, eyes sharp, voice cool. "You are responsible for every action your company executes under your authority, whether signed by your hand or not." He cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't think I'm on trial here." Clara paused, looked up slowly. "No," she said, "not yet." The room went still. Gordon's lawyer leaned over and whispered something. He nodded, forced a smile, and adjusted his cuffs. But something in his posture changed. He glanced at Clara again, longer this time, like she was starting to bother him and he didn't know why. That evening, Clara sat in her chambers long after the others had left. She placed the hospital surveillance photo on her desk, the one no one else had ever seen. There he was, Gordon, 27 years younger, holding a bundled infant near a service exit. The timestamp glared 3:17 a.m., and below it, scrawled in pen, her own note. The moment he tried to forget, she turned off the lights. The city buzzed below her office windows. Neon signs, taxi horns, street lights flickering like heartbeat monitors. And she wondered if Gordon remembered the river, if the sound of water still haunted him in quiet moments, if he ever once thought about the life he tried to discard, or if his only regret was that it didn't work. But Clara wasn't angry. She had shed that skin years ago. What she felt now wasn't vengeance. It was responsibility. a slow, gathering storm, and tomorrow it would break. By the fourth day of testimony, the cracks began to show, not in the plaintiffs, not in the case, but in Gordon Leland. He was used to control of rooms, people, narratives, but something about this courtroom unsettled him. It wasn't the facts, or the evidence, or even the public gallery that whispered every time he entered. It was her, Judge Clara Reed, the way she watched him, not hostile, not cruel, just still, unblinking, like she already knew how the story ended. That morning, a young woman named Tina Alvarez testified. She worked as a leasing agent under one of Leland's subsidiaries. Her voice shook at first, but she found her rhythm. "They told us to falsify reports," she said, "to make it look like tenants had violated their lease agreements. If someone missed one payment even by accident, we'd send termination notices." "And who gave that directive?" Clara asked. Tina hesitated. "A man named Gerald Parsons. But I believe the pressure came from the top being Mr. Leland." "Yes. Did you ever speak to Mr. Leland directly?" "Once," Tina said, "at a company event. He told me, quote, 'If they can't pay, they don't deserve the roof.'" A few people in the audience gasped. Clara remained still. She looked at Gordon. He didn't flinch, but he didn't smile either. During the recess, Clara sat in her chambers staring at a blank page in her notebook. No doodles, no annotations, just white space. It mirrored how she felt. She had spent years building her life brick by brick, refusing to let her origin story define her. She thought she was beyond it now, but seeing Gordon speak, hearing the callousness in his tone, it reopened something inside her. A wound she thought had scarred over, and for the first time in a long time, she doubted herself. That evening, after court adjourned, she took the long way home, walked past storefronts lit by fluorescent signs, past a man singing on the corner and a woman clutching a sleeping child on the L train steps. Clara stopped, watched the mother gently kiss her daughter's forehead, shield her from the wind with her coat, and Clara thought, what would my life have been if Eleanor hadn't been standing on that riverbank? The next day, Clara entered the courtroom with steel in her spine. She called a private bench session with both legal teams. "I've reviewed additional materials submitted in confidence," she began, voice calm but direct. "There may be grounds to escalate charges related to perjury and systemic fraud. I've alerted the district attorney's office." Gordon's lawyer objected immediately. "Your Honor, this is unexpected and prejudicial. May I ask what these materials include?" Clara looked at him evenly, then at Gordon. She saw it again, the flicker of recognition that didn't quite land, like a name on the tip of a tongue. She said nothing. Yet, court resumed. Gordon took the stand again for a cross-examination. This time, Clara herself asked the questions. "Mr. Leland, do you recall reporting the death of your daughter 27 years ago?" Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated. Gordon blinked. "Excuse me, I'll repeat the question. Do you recall filing a death report for your newborn daughter 3 days after her birth in North Bend County, Virginia?" He turned slightly pale. "That has nothing to do with this case. It pertains to your credibility," Clara replied. "Did you file the report?" He hesitated. "Yes, it was a tragedy. No remains were ever recovered, no autopsy conducted, no funeral held. I was grieving," he said, too quickly. Clara leaned forward slightly. were you grieving, Mr. Leland, or hiding something?" The silence was crushing. Gordon's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, I must request an immediate sidebar and ask that these questions be stricken from the record." Clara nodded calmly. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." As the courtroom emptied, Gordon didn't move. He stared at Clara. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, recognition hit him like a falling building. The gray eyes, the stillness, the flannel detail on her bench robe stitched by Eleanor as a gift. His face paled. His mouth opened, then closed. Clara didn't speak. She just stood and walked back into her chambers, her heels clicking like a gavel. She closed the door, locked it, collapsed into her chair, and finally let herself exhale. The moment had come. But it wasn't about rage, or vengeance, or tears. It was about truth. And truth, she realized, doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it walks in wearing a robe. That night, Judge Clara Reed didn't go home. She sat at her desk long after the janitors finished mopping the marble halls, long after the courthouse lights dimmed to security mode. Her office was quiet, but her mind wasn't. On the desk before her A-printed DNA report, a notarized affidavit from a nurse who remembered Gordon Leland checking out early that night, cradling a sleeping baby, and a black and white surveillance photo. She had all the pieces, everything she needed, everything she had waited for. But the question that gnawed at her ribs wasn't legal. It was human. What would justice look like for someone like her? The next morning, she filed a confidential report with the district attorney's office, included evidence of child abandonment, falsified death documentation, and circumstantial proof of attempted murder. She didn't label herself the victim. She didn't include her name, just the facts, just the truth. When court convened, tension buzzed under the surface like electricity in the walls. Gordon Leland sat rigid at the defense table. He had read something in her expression yesterday, something terrible. And now he waited for a shoe he couldn't see to drop. Clara entered with the same quiet authority she always did. But this time, something had changed. She looked lighter, as if the burden she carried had become fuel instead of weight. She called a closed-door conference with both legal teams. Inside the chamber, the air was still. The attorneys sat. Gordon sat. Clara remained standing. "There's a matter I need to disclose," she began. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake, but it held the entire room. "I have considered recusal, but after consulting with the Federal Ethics Board and reviewing precedent, I've decided transparency is more appropriate than retreat." Gordon's attorney frowned. "Your Honor, what exactly are you disclosing?" Clara turned to Gordon fully this time. And he knew. He knew. But still, he whispered, "No." She continued, 27 years ago, Mr. Leland reported the death of his newborn daughter. No body was ever recovered, no death certificate issued. But a hospital exit camera captured him leaving at 3:17, carrying an infant. She slid a photo onto the desk. That infant survived. She was found in a river, wrapped in linen, rescued by strangers. Gordon went utterly still. The color drained from his face. Clara's voice remained even. That child grew up in a quiet Illinois town. She studied law. She graduated top of her class, and she became a federal judge. She paused. And now, she sits across from you. Gordon leaned forward like the floor had shifted under him. "You." "Yes," Clara said simply. I am the daughter you tried to erase." The room fell so quiet. The wall clock ticking sounded like thunder. Gordon's lawyer scrambled for words. We need to suspend proceedings immediately. My client is—" "No," Gordon croaked, still staring at Clara. How did you find me? I wasn't looking for you." Clara said, "I was looking for the truth." He shook his head. "I thought you were gone." "I was," she replied, "gone from your life, not from the world." He opened his mouth to speak again. She held up a hand. "I'm not here to hear apologies or excuses. This isn't revenge, Mr. Leland. It's accountability. I filed the evidence with the DA this morning. They'll pursue charges: abandonment, fraud, falsifying death records. You'll face those consequences, but not in my court. I'm recusing myself effective immediately." Gordon's hands trembled as he reached for the desk. "I didn't know you'd survive," he whispered. "That's the part that defines you," Clara said, her tone like stone wrapped in silk. "You didn't wonder if I would. You didn't care." After the chamber emptied, Clara sat alone. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just breathed. The kind of breath you take after holding it for 27 years. By evening, headlines blared across every outlet: "Real estate mogul under criminal investigation." After shocking courtroom revelation, Judge Clara Reed reveals identity as Leland's abandoned daughter. Gordon's board members resigned in a wave. Sponsors pulled out. Public opinion turned like a tide. And Gordon Leland, once untouchable, now faced not just a civil case, but a criminal one. Eleanor Reed called that night. Clara answered on the first ring. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked. "I think," Clara whispered, "for the first time in my life, I actually am." And far away, in a quiet suburb, an older woman saw the news report. Her hand shook as she reached for the photo on her mantel herself, 27 years younger, holding a baby girl for 3 days before her child was lost. Her name was Lillian Marsh. She whispered to the screen, "Clara." The courtroom was packed. Cameras weren't allowed, but the press lined the marble corridors outside. Reporters waited like hawks, pens ready, headlines half-written. Inside, Clara Reed sat in the last row, not as judge, not as victim, just as herself. She wore no robe, no title, no armor, just a gray sweater and a silver pin Eleanor had given her after her first court appointment. It read, "Truth has weight. Carry it well." Gordon Leland entered flanked by 2 attorneys and a federal marshal. His suit hung loose now, like it no longer fit the man who wore it. He looked older, deflated. He didn't look at Clara. She didn't need him to. The judge, presiding today, a colleague Clara respected, read out the charges: corporate fraud, obstruction of justice, abandonment of a minor, falsification of official death records. Gordon pled guilty to all counts, not out of remorse, out of inevitability. When asked if he wanted to speak before sentencing, he stood slowly and turned toward Clara. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice rough, "and I wouldn't deserve it." Clara met his eyes but said nothing. "I did a terrible thing. I lived with it by pretending it never happened." A pause. "I see now that silence doesn't make something disappear. It just delays the collapse." He lowered his head. "I'm sorry." Clara rose, gently. The judge allowed it. She stepped forward, her hands steady. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear but soft. "I have no desire to respond to Mr. Leland's apology. I'm not here to debate its sincerity. I'm here to remind this court and myself that justice is not vengeance. It's not punishment for pain. It's the balance we restore when someone tries to tip the scales. Mr. Leland didn't just abandon a child. He erased a name, a history, a future. But I lived. I lived because two people saw something worth saving. She looked at Gordon once more. You didn't destroy me. You just helped define me. The judge handed down the sentence. 15 years. No parole. Restitution for the plaintiffs. Loss of corporate ownership. Public record exposure. Gordon didn't resist. He simply turned, wrists offered. Clara watched him go and didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clear for the first time in days. Eleanor stood near the bottom of the steps, hands in her coat, eyes warm. Next to her stood a woman with gray curls and a trembling chin, Lillian Marsh. Clara had met her the week before. Quietly, privately. The DNA match had been undeniable, but the real proof came when Lillian pulled out an old photo from a dusty box, Clara's newborn face. Those same gray eyes, wrapped in a hospital blanket with the name Marsh written in ink. I never believed you died, Lillian had whispered through tears. Not really. There was no proof, no goodbye, just a man who told me it was over. Clara had sat in stunned silence. I wasn't well back then, Lillian admitted. They said I wasn't stable enough to keep you. And maybe I wasn't. But I would have loved you. Now, the three women stood together on the courthouse steps. Clara stepped forward and looped her arms around both of them. One on either side. One who had given her life. One who had saved it. She didn't have the words for what that moment was. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, but it was real. And for Clara, that was enough. Later that evening, back in her apartment, Clara opened the small cedar box under her bed. Inside, the pink flannel shirt, the DNA report, the photo of Gordon at the hospital door, and a blank page. She added a note. In her own handwriting, he left me in silence. But I chose to speak. She closed the lid, placed it gently back under the bed, not to forget, but to let go. The next morning, she returned to work. Not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to protect. Truth, balance, and the belief that no child should ever be defined by the cruelty of the one who left them behind. Clara's first case that day involved a single mother facing eviction. She listened closely, asked careful questions, took notes not just with ink but with empathy. Because now, more than ever, she understood justice isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It speaks softly, but it endures. And sometimes, the child who was nearly forgotten becomes the one who makes sure no one else is. She was never supposed to survive. But Clara Reed did more than survive. She lived with purpose, from a riverbank soaked in rain to a courtroom where silence broke wide open. She carried not revenge but responsibility. And in doing so, she became what her father never imagined, a voice, a judge, a reckoning. This story reminds us love can begin with strangers. Justice doesn't always wear anger, and every child, no matter their gender or origin, deserves to be seen, valued, and protected. Let us not forget Gordon. Leland didn't just abandon his daughter, he discarded her because she was a girl. That kind of cruelty still hides in boardrooms, hospitals, and homes, but it cannot hide from truth forever. Clara's story isn't about the pain of being left behind. It's about the quiet power of rising anyway, And maybe it's also about all the lives changed when just one person chooses not to look away. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true-to-heart stories that challenge and heal. We're not done. More stories are coming, stories that ask hard questions and leave you with something to carry. Until next time.